want to read from here? You okay? Well, the section that Neville's going to read this morning is on the Good Samaritan. So it's probably one of the most familiar Bible passages. You probably learned it in Sunday school. You probably heard 1,000 sermons about it if you've been going to church all your life. So this is a depiction of the story itself. There's thousands of them on the internet if you want to look. That's probably, it looks like it's a fairly medieval picture. You'll notice the sort of monk-looking cleric in the background with a tonsure as opposed to what it would look like in Jesus' time, which would be mostly long hair and a robe. So this is probably Middle Ages painting. Can you put the map up, Dave? So one of the things I was curious about, now when we tell the story, we use the Samaritan, the Good Samaritan. The reason that he's keynoted in the story is because the Jews from Jerusalem and the Samaritans didn't get along. And they have a long history of that, which continues to the modern day. This is the old map here. So you see at the top is Galilee, the bottom is Judea, and Samaria is in the middle. Now that, one of the first kings of Assyria who came in and he broke up the kingdom of Israel, which was a unified kingdom from top to bottom under David. It was a full kingdom. And then when the Assyrians came in and conquered it, in order to separate it and decentralize power, they made the province of Samaria in the middle. It's named after an ancient city called Samaria. Now what's interesting about it is they worshipped on the mountain rather than at the temple. And that separated the Samaritans. They were still Jewish by nature and conviction, but they were the pariahs of the Israeli Jews. And so they were considered untouchable, unclean, and that they were kind of misguided in terms of their faith. Sometimes, you know, what happens between denominations, and particularly in Protestantism. But what's interesting is that the province of Samaria, right up until the 1960s, was still claimed by Jordan. In 1964, it was given full authority to the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, and that's where the state of Palestine is now, in particular, the West Bank. So it's still being argued over today. I mean, they're still trying to... So that's a long explanation, but I thought you might find it interesting. Sorry, Neville, to make you stand so long.
The parable of the Good Samaritan. A teacher of the law came up and tried to trap Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to receive eternal life?" Jesus answered him, "What do the scriptures say? How do you interpret them?" The man answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as you love yourself." "You are right," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But the teacher of the law wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus answered, "There was once a man who was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when robbers attacked him, stripped him, and beat him up, leaving him half dead. It so happened that a priest was going down that road. But when he saw the man, he walked on by on the other side. In the same way, a Levite also came there, went over and looked at the man, and then walked on by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was traveling that way came upon the man, and when he saw him, his heart was filled with pity. He went over to him, poured oil and wine on his wounds, and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own animal and took him to an inn, where he took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. "Take care of him," he told the innkeeper, "and when I come back this way, I will pay you whatever else you spend on him." And Jesus concluded, "In your opinion, which one of these 3 acted like a neighbor toward the man attacked by the robbers?" The teacher of the law answered, "The one who was kind to him." Jesus replied, "You go then and do the same." I just dropped Presbyterians are.
So, we're going to talk about, you're doing a great job, Dave. Poor Dave is panicking up here using this screen. He's controlling all of the screen from his little tablet, and he warned me he might be a little slow. So it's always good to have a hymn book close, just in case we get a mix. I didn't think you liked verse 3 of one of those hymns, so we skip that. But you're being good. So, the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan, it's been preached about a million times, and the concept I want to look at today is the idea of being a good person. Now, the United Church, we often talk about being a good person, but we don't often say, what does it mean to be a good person? Right? We just accept that people will know what it is to be a good person. So I'm going to explore that with you with a couple of different ideas of good people. So let's put up number 1 there. And do we know who that is? Mr. Rogers. Now, the reason I picked Mr. Rogers because I remember being in seminary, and one of the United Church professors said, you know what he says, one of the problems with the United Church ministers is they look like Mr. Rogers in a dress. Because remember in those days, we all wore gowns, right? And he said, and the only advice they ever give on every Sunday when they preach a sermon is, be nice to your neighbor and don't kick your dog. And every time I've seen Mr. Rogers since then, I think about that. Now, is he a good person? And what makes him good?
Because he's teaching children
Okay.
to be open
So teaching children to be open and caring, non-racist. Didn't he have a black postman on the show? He had somebody on the show that it was the emperor. It was a good friend of his. And I'm not completely 100%, but was he not a Presbyterian minister? He was, right? Yeah, that's what I thought. So there you go. He has to be a good person, right? But, when you think of Mr. Roger and you compare that to the Good Samaritan, it's a kind of a different kind of goodness, though, isn't it? Right? One's a kind of risky goodness, and Mr. Rogers is a nice goodness. Like you would say he's a nice man, right? Almost too good to be true in some ways. But apparently all the stuff I've read on him is true. He was exactly who he portrayed himself to. And was loved by children all through their lives, just from the way that he reacted to them. So now I have another example of a nice person. A good person. And no, it's not Denzel Washington. So I know that's what you were thinking. Who's this? Very good. Malcolm X. Now what was Malcolm X known for? Civil rights movement. And what faith was he? He was Muslim. That's right. He converted to Muslim very early on, before a lot of black folks in the States were converting to Islam. One of the things you should know about Islam, if you don't know it, generally speaking, not universally, it was one of the first major world religions which was non-racist. Anybody could become a Muslim in any country, anywhere. And there was not any separation between the two. Even in the States, in the U.S. today, there are black churches and white churches. Both singing the same hymns. And both who would not go to the other church. Right? So it is a little bit of an interesting thing. In most mosques, anybody from anywhere can come in the mosque and is welcomed if they're Islam as a member. So it's an interesting thing. But was Malcolm X a nice man? You know much about his history? He was very much in favor of civil disobedience. He was very much rile people up and get them to go against the man. You remember that expression? When I was in New York the first time in the 70s, and walked down into Times Square, the Muslim Brotherhood would be preaching every day. And they'd all be dressed up, and they'd be converting people right on the street to change America, to change the system. So I think he was a very good man, but I don't think he was a very nice man. You see what I mean? So how do you make those declinations? It's interesting for us. I guess you choose who you want to be. So, who do we have next? Now, who's that? Now, was Mother Teresa a good person? Now, why was she good? She helped children. What was she known for most? working in the slums of Calcutta, mostly with people with leprosy. And there's many, many stories told about her going to the gutters in Calcutta and picking lepers out of the gutter and washing them and cleaning them and taking them back to her home. She was one of the only religious orders that would do that. Now, the question is, though, she's a good person, but is she a nice person? She had a wicked temper. And I don't know if you knew this. She opened one of her Sisters of Charity, I believe it was, I think. Anyway, she opened one in Los Angeles, and it had a very wealthy benefactor to help her get it started. And when she came over from India to sort of christen it and make sure they were doing it her way, she realized they all had fancy mattresses. And she threw every one of them out the window. She said, when you work with the poor, you'll live like the poor. I don't think the sisters liked her very much. But again, you see the difference in the sort of the edginess of being good. What does it mean to be good? And what's the difference between being good and nice, being good and rebellious, being good and revolutionary? And where are you in that? What would you like to be if you're going to choose one of those? Now, I got an interesting story for you. I think it's interesting. And you're a captive audience, so you're going to just have to let me tell it. So I was coming back from Prince Edward Island. And I was driving back with my mother, who had flown down to see her sister. And apparently I'm my mother's date now. So whenever she needs a ride home, I go pick her up. So we're coming back from PEI back to Toronto, or back up here. And I got a phone call. And a guy left a message, and I stopped and I called him back. And he was my neighbor when we lived in Newmarket. And I've talked about him before. He's a Cambodian. And there was a house full of Cambodians on one side of us and a house full of Cambodians on the other side. And they'd been on our street for 35 years. And when Colleen and I moved in, we're very nosy. Or, I don't know, gregarious, I guess is a better word. I'm very nosy. And anyway, I went over and kind of made friends with them because I found them fascinating. So they came to our house one night, and they said we were the first house they'd been in on the street in 35 years, other than each other's. And so they kind of adopted us. And if you know anything about Cambodians, every weekend they all get together en masse in one of their houses. So there'd be like 35 or 40 people in this house. So Colleen and I would go over and sit and listen to them, and after a couple of hours, they would start telling us stories about Cambodia. And if you remember your history, they lived there during the Pol Pot time, when Pol Pot was massacring his own people. And they told us stories about living in the jungle, having to leave their homes, being sold into slavery, having their family members shot. And so when they would get together in community, they would share these stories with anybody who was new after a few Heineken. It seemed to be the prerequisite. They were convinced Heineken didn't give hangovers, so that was the beer of choice. And so we would be very privy to this very difficult, traumatic life that they had had, and how they'd come to Canada to get away from it. But you could see the scars on them. You could see the marks on them, the marks in their souls. They drank way too much. They partied way too much. They stayed up too late. And they were really hurting when they got to tell their stories. But they were good people. They were great neighbors. So I get a call from this. Now, sorry, get back to my story now. I get a call from the guy next door, who I haven't talked to in 3 years. He still doesn't speak very good English after 35 years. I won't do his accent, but it is funny. And he says, "Allan, where are you?" I said, "I'm on my way home." And he said, "Are you not in PEI?" I said, "No." He goes, "Oh, that's too bad, because I'm in New Brunswick on my way to PEI." So I knew something was coming, right? So I said, is there something I can help you with? He says, "Is anybody in your cottage?" These phone calls always go like this. I said, as a matter of fact, no. I said, "How many people are with you?" Because they're Cambodians, right? They do not travel in singles or pairs, right? And he said, "I have 5. I said, okay, it will just sleep 5. It's a very small place. And then he told me this. He'd become a monk. Isn't that the wildest thing you've ever heard? So he's traveling. He's on the left there. His name is Hing. He's traveling with 4 other monks. So I said, please take lots of pictures. So that's one inside the cottage. He sent me all these the next day. There they are outside. They don't have the same tolerance for weather that we do. It's a little windy down there. And there's one more there, Dave. And I think they're trying to look holy. I'm going to have to talk to Hing about this because he's usually always laughing. But you know, again, when we talk about being a good person, I thought after I talked to Hing and I looked at all the pictures they'd sent up, and they were gone right away. The neighbors, by the way, think I'm nuts. Right? Even my mother, as we're driving home, said, "Are you a magnet for strange people?" I said, "I proudly am, Mother." But I thought about, you know, when you deal with goodness and trauma at the same time, you only have a couple of choices, don't you? Right? It either marks you in a negative way and makes you bitter and angry, or something in your heart changes and you become more wonderful. And I think of Hing at this point in his age becoming a monk and avowing all kinds of things that he would have done before so that he could return to whatever he was when he was young before he experienced all that trauma in his life. And it really touched me, the fact that he still called me up and said, "Can I stay at your place?" Right? I really felt, I said to Mom, I said, "I can't say no. How could I? I mean, who could not? I'm getting that framed and put on the wall." Right? I feel like a rock star came or something. I thought about this idea, we can be nice, but that's revolutionary. Like, that's a revolutionary action that man has taken. And he'll dedicate the rest of his life to doing good, not just to being good. I think it's quite fascinating. So I came across a term that I had never heard of before. Can you put up there, Dave? Atelophobia. It's the fear of imperfection, the fear of never being good enough. You ever experience that? Huh? Never being good enough. I think most of us who were brought up in the church have experienced that, right? Of never quite making the mark. Never quite being good enough. I didn't realize there was a phobia about it. I thought that was quite fascinating. I think we're going to put this in our bulletin cover from now on. But you know, I was thinking one of the reasons I've been focusing on goodness is because Sylvia's husband had died several weeks ago. And one of the things Sylvia said that people said about her husband was that he was a good person. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Because when people die, we usually say, "Oh, they were amazing, they were spectacular, they were great." All of which is not true, right? Just because someone dies, they don't become spectacular all of a sudden. But the fact that somebody could be good and is known as a good person struck me as such a strong way to identify someone in their life. And I started thinking about, you know, my grandfather was a good man. He was a very simple man, but he was a good man. And when I think about how I'd like to be, I don't think about Malcolm X or Mother Teresa. I think about him because he was good and he was nice, but he was very, very quiet. And I think one of the things the church has done us a disservice is that it is almost always focused on what's wrong with us and not what's good with us. And I like to think in my later years, like I won't become a monk, I guarantee you that. My wife will attest to that. I'd like to think the kind of messages that we bring in church are the ones that lift us up, not the ones that break us down. And the idea of exploring, because we're all different, we're all good in different ways, how we can be good in the world. Now we had I think that's the last one, isn't it, Dave? Oh, is there one more? Oh, yes. This is my conclusion. Your beliefs don't make you a better person, your behavior does. In our study group this year, we looked at a book by Karen Armstrong called The Axial Age. which she talked about the formation of all the world's religions and how that within an 800-year period they were all formed at the same time. And one of the things that she said that struck me was that she said the Buddha and Jesus and even Muhammad at the beginning, they didn't care what a person's beliefs were. They cared about how they acted. They felt, Buddha in particular, felt your beliefs were your own personal thing. They didn't have to be shared. But your actions were what made you. And the story of the Good Samaritan is not about belief. You notice that? In fact, it pokes at belief because the first two people who come by, what are they? They're clerics, right? And they don't want to touch a person who's bleeding because then they won't be able to go to the temple. But the Samaritan who's despised is the one who believes something completely different than everybody else who was past. But his actions speak louder than words. And the Buddha and Jesus and many, many other theologians have always said it always boils down to in the end. Your beliefs don't make you a better person or a good person. Your behavior is what makes you a good person. Thank you. So, I don't know if you know this, but I asked, are you going to do it?
A little piece of it.
Okay. Just in case you hear, I said to Dan, I thought a perfect offertory response to the sermon was an old Joe Cocker song. Oh Lord.
Don't let me be.
No.
Don't let me be misunderstood.
Yeah. Don't let me be misunderstood. I'm a poor boy whose intentions are good. Oh Lord, don't let me be misunderstood. God, we offer these gifts in return for all the gifts you give us each and every day of our lives. We offer them from the work of our hands and the love of our hearts, and we dedicate them to the mission of your church in this world. Amen. The pastoral prayer, which is on the screens, I believe, and in the bulletin as well. In our prayers, let us give thanks for the gifts of God and pray for those who work in God's vineyard. For the bounty of the earth, for the goodness within the human heart, for power to change and the will to learn, let us give thanks. For all those who work for healing, for people in caring ministries, for ecologists and researchers, for pastoral care workers and friends, for the hands of Christ in the world. For those who struggle for liberation and justice, for the witness of base communities, for mission and development workers, for those who risk their lives for others, for those who work for human rights, for those who speak truth on behalf of the oppressed, for all who bear witness to the way of Christ. Let us give thanks. We give you thanks, blessed Spirit. Amen. Before we sing our last hymn, Dave, are we having coffee or lemonade on the lawn or downstairs? All right, you're all welcome to come downstairs. Was I long-winded this morning? You sure? I felt like I was making up for 2 weeks. So I wasn't sure. Just wanted to make sure. And the other thing I keep forgetting to do is these lovely flowers appear every week, and I don't know where they come from. Where do they come from? Who's gonna put their hand up and say they brought them or put them here? Well, whoever it is, thank you very much. Somebody mentioned it to me last week, and I said, it's like everything in this church, it just happens by magic. Things just show up on season. So thank you very much for whoever brings the flowers. We'll sing our final hymn, 299, Teach Me, God, to Wonder. And now may the peace of God, which surpasses all human understanding, keep watch over our minds and hearts, bodies and souls, this day and forevermore. Amen.